Now, good morning, Mr. Turner.
Good morning, my Lord. This morning, my Lord, we have a panel comprising Reverend Dr. Martin Stewart Hodgson of the Baptist Union of Scotland, the Right Reverend Andrew Swift, Bishop of the Scottish Episcopal Church, and the Very Reverend Dr. Thomas G. Cannon Shields from the Catholic Church.
Very good. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Right, now, on you go, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Lord. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
If I could just remind you before we start, this morning's hearing will be transcribed. If we could try and speak slowly and clearly, that will help our stenographers greatly. I'm going to ask each of you, if I may, first of all, if you could state your full name, confirm your organisation and just your role within that organisation, or roles within that organisation. Dr. Hodgson, if I could come to you first.
Yeah, I'm Martin Stewart Hodgson. I'm the General Director of the Baptist Union of Scotland.
Thank you.
And I'm Andrew Christopher Swift, the Scottish Episcopal Bishop of Brechin and part of the College of Bishops, the leadership in the Scottish Episcopal Church.
Thank you. And Canon.
And I'm Thomas Joseph Shields, Parish Priest of St Fillan's in Crieff and Director of Education for Dunkeld Diocese.
Thank you. So that's you. If I may, I'd like to ask you now just a couple of brief questions about your organisations, the history and tradition, the size of your church, the number of parishioners, and just perhaps the geographical spread of the organisation. Again, Dr. Hodgson, if I could come to you first.
Certainly. So the Baptist Union is a network of 155 churches spread right across Scotland, from the Northern Isles to the borders and from the East Coast to the Hebrides. We would have a monthly attendance of 17,000 people, with 9,500 people identifying as committed members who've been through a formal process of membership. There would be a lot of youth and children involved in our churches. Most of our churches give special attention to providing groups for that age range. That would be really the scope of our network.
Thank you. And Bishop?
So the Scottish Episcopal Church has roots going way back to a sister church of the Church of Scotland, and roots going all the way back to the earliest bits of Christianity. We've got 7 dioceses, areas of Scotland that we cover, and something in the order of about 300 churches, some bigger, some smaller. Again, we cover all of Scotland, from the Northern Isles, East Coast, West Coast, all the way down to the English border. We've got when we count ourselves, about 21,000 people who describe themselves as members. The census says there's way more Anglicans than that in Scotland. We're part of the Anglican Church, but we'd count ourselves about 20,000. And there's about 150 or so paid clergy in leadership, leading those 300 or so communities, worship, pastoral activities, that sort of thing.
Thank you. Karen.
And the Catholic Church has roots which go back to the foundation of Christianity. In Scotland, we have 8 dioceses, 8 bishops, again covering the whole of Scotland. We would have a membership of about 780,000 who are declared as baptised Catholics. Of those, say, about 15% would regularly practice their faith. And the number of parishes I wouldn't know off the top of my head, but we have about 1,000 clergy, something like that, who minister to our hundreds of parishes.
Thank you. If I could just ask a couple of follow-up questions to that. Dr. Hodgson, first of all, you mentioned that the churches are independent. Could you just explain that a little for us?
Yeah, so the nature of Baptist churches is that each congregation is autonomous. So I use the word network to describe us. We've existed since 1869 as our current network of churches. So I, as the general director, have no kind of linear authority over local churches. Our theological emphasis has always been that the fundamental unit of church is what happens locally locally, and then church grows by local churches kind of networking or being in fellowship with one another. So I guess as General Director, I'm not in a position to say this is what the Baptist Church has said it will do, but I'm able to kind of represent the views and the experience of Baptist churches around the country. And a lot of my role is being the glue that kind of holds that network together.
Thank you. And Bishop, you mentioned 300 churches, and I think you said around 150 ordained members. How does that work operationally if you've got less ordained members than churches?
So most of the ordained clergy would be looking after more than one of the church communities, the charges. So on a Sunday morning, the cleric might do more than one service at different times, or quite often one week the cleric would be leading the service, the next week it might be a retired colleague or an unpaid and non-stipendiary colleague or a trained layperson or something else might be offered. So there's quite a network of different people working in ministry, but led by the smaller number of stipendiary paid clergy.
Thank you. And Canon, I'm going to come on to the statements you've each given in a moment. Your statement makes reference to Bishop McGee's statement that's been given. The bishop gave evidence earlier. Could you explain to us, just in terms of organisationally, how the Catholic Church is organised, just in terms of its arrangements? We've heard from Dr. Hodgson that the churches are independent. Is that the same in the Catholic Church, or is it more organised, I should say, than that?
We use the word communion most often, a communion of bishops. Although each bishop is canonically the Pope, if you like, in his own diocese, he has to be in communion with the Bishop of Rome, otherwise known as the Pope, but otherwise works fairly independently, in communion again with his clergy and with lay people, particularly those involved in lay ministry. The bishops also work in conferences. That's been a feature since the 1983 Code of Canon Law, that the Conference of Bishops up until then were a kind of informal sort of body. They work far more in concert, have regular meetings, particularly on national issues, as they would have had, for example, during the COVID pandemic.
Thank you. As I said, the three of you have given statements to the inquiry. Dr. Hodgson, your statement is reference SCI WT 05371. Bishop, yours is reference SCI WT 07431. Sorry, 7431. And Canon, yours is SCI WT 08951, which makes reference to Bishop McGee's statement SCI WT 07. Sorry, that can't be the same. That's the wrong number. Excuse me. Sorry, WT 03171. I'd like to ask you some questions now about the matters which we touched upon in your statements, if I may. First of all, I'm going to ask you some questions. Just by way of background, we're obviously going to come on to talk about changes during the pandemic, but I'd like to let his Lordship have a bit of a feel regarding the kind of religious services and observance which are observed in the traditions in the normal, both in normal times during the pandemic as well, but just so we can get a feel of the sort of baseline of practice, if we may. Dr. Hodgson, could I ask you, first of all, what is the sort of general weekly observance that someone might have within the Baptist Union?
Yeah, so just about all our churches would have a Sunday morning worship gathering as the centre of their worshipping life, and this would, within our tradition, tend to have a high emphasis on the preaching, and the sermon would be an important part of that. The kind of experience of corporate worship, especially with singing, is a very big part of worship in Baptist churches. churches, communal singing. Alongside Sunday worship, most churches would be running a children's program for all or part of the time the adults gather together. Most churches would see at least half of their members meeting in a kind of small group Bible study or similar typically on a weeknight or a weekday during the week, and that would probably be the kind of second core meeting. Many churches would have a prayer meeting for the whole church at some point during the week as well, and then typically during the week there would be age-appropriate gatherings for children and young people outside of Sunday worship. That would be a typical rhythm for the kind of the worshipping community, really.
And in terms of participation, is that the kind of thing that most people come on a regular basis, or do people come in and out? Do you see the same faces every week, or is it a changeable view?
Well, in Sunday worship, our best kind of exploration of the statistics are that about 2/3 of the total number of worshippers would be there any given Sunday. So if there are, it seems there are, as I mentioned, 17,000 people who would come at least once a month, if you like, and of those 2/3 typically would be present on any Sunday.
The clue might be in the name of the church, but is baptism an important part of the tradition?
You followed the clue correctly. It is. Yeah, it's significant for us that we would say baptism rightly comes when a person has individually embraced the Christian faith, the way of Christ, and made a personal commitment to that which they are ready to profess publicly of their own volition. So we refer to baptism usually as believers' baptism. So that would be an important part of our practice. It would be the normal way of admission into church membership, and always a great celebration in the church when people are baptised. People would typically tell a little bit of their own story and their own journey to faith before publicly being baptised during one of the Sunday services.
Are people all baptised the same way? I mean, baptism, I think, probably means different things mechanically. I mean, in different traditions, is there a particular approach that's taken to baptism?
Indeed. So our baptisms would all be by total immersion. So most of our church buildings have a pool built into the floor. Some don't and use other methods, but we'd always baptise people by total immersion, which for us is redolent with meaning, really, about dying with Christ, being buried with him, and rising to life, and cleansing, and so on. And so that would be our practice.
Thank you. Bishop, if I could come to you next. Again, if you could give us a kind of indication of the sort of normal observance.
Yeah. So very, very similar in a sense to the Baptist Church. A Sunday morning celebration would be the normal centre of the heartbeat. We have a tradition where a communion service, where bread and wine used in the service is the centre of what we would do, and the communion, the bread and wine shared, and a sermon, probably a bit shorter than you would get in the Baptist Church, would also be offered as a balanced part of the service we'd have on a Sunday morning. Again, some children's work would happen in some of our churches. Music, an important bit of that. Every church would have music of some sort on the Sunday morning. Some have choirs who would gather and sing special pieces of music within the church service. A small number of our maybe larger but less formal churches would have a music group and a much larger, more lively sort of way of worshipping, but it's still music. And there's a sacramental side. We'd also have midweek services, probably another communion service happening at some point in the middle of the week, and then a heartbeat of social activities, the members of the church gathering for each other's company, fundraising, doing outreach activities as well. But again, a pattern of Sunday and midweek worship would be normal.
Thank you. And again, sorry, I say finally, that's not really what I mean, Canon, but if I could come to you next, and if you could give us an indication just in terms of the Catholic Church, how that's approached.
At the centre of our Catholic life is the celebration of Mass, which consists of two main parts, the Word of God, followed by a short sermon, and then the celebration of the Eucharist, where we believe that the bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ for the good of the people. Sundays would again be when most of our Catholics gather. We also have Masses on Saturday evenings, and then most parishes would have a Mass every day, or most days, at which a handful of regular faithful would come along, mostly in the mornings, and celebrate Mass. The celebration of sacraments is also very important to us, and that's often done in concert with our Catholic schools, which do a lot of the preparation for us and provide a good outreach and connection with our parents, who may not themselves come along regularly to Mass, but they would come along at particular occasions: First Communion, Confirmation, First Reconciliation services. Again, our youth work tends to be focused on our schools, but we also have a lot of parishes who would have youth work. And of course, our people gather together for, the traditional cup of tea every so often after Mass, and they involve themselves in visiting and outreach work to the poor and cooperation with local churches and their projects.
Do the churches get involved in other services? Services, I don't mean services from a church perspective, services as in to the community. I'm aware we've heard evidence earlier in the week regarding other programmes and things that the churches sometimes get involved with. Do the Catholic Church get involved in those kind of programmes?
Very much so. Again, it depends on the local level what's happening. For us, there's also the element of taking communion to the sick, which can also lead to connections, particularly with care homes and hospitals, where there are sometimes services done there for bringing some of the residents together for short services. And again, in concert with the churches and other organisations like Christians Against Poverty, for example, the church would get itself involved in that, as I say, usually in partnership with other churches and organisations.
Thank you. That's helpful. We've got a kind of understanding, I think, now in terms of what happens in the ordinary week, and then, of course, we come to 2020, when the weeks were no longer ordinary. If I could perhaps again come to you, Bishop, in this case, could you tell us about the impact of COVID and how the Church dealt with that?
Yeah. I think everybody was aware in early 2020, as the news started reporting that this virus was appearing, and the bishops of the Scottish Episcopal Church, the seven of us for the seven dioceses, felt that the safety of the members of our churches was becoming a concern for us. So a few days when restrictions were starting to be talked about, I think people, if they were feeling unwell, were being told to stay home. I looked it up. I think it was the 17th of March we decided that services should stop in our churches. So a little while before lockdown actually happened. It just didn't feel pastorally appropriate for our people to continue to meet. I think some wanted to stop and it gave them permission. Others wanted to continue and it made them stop. So we did take a unilateral decision that we would stop having regular patterns of worship from a little bit before the actual lockdowns hit in March. So the normal pattern, the Sundays, the midweeks, the social activities, all of that stopped.
Was that then an instruction that came down from the top, as it were, to the churches?
It was. I'm not sure technically we had the authority to make that happen, but we exercised the influential power, and by and large people complied with it.
Thank you. And Canon, could I ask you, again, talking about the start of the pandemic, what happened in the Catholic Church?
A very similar story to the Episcopal Church. We already had picked up that this virus was around and people were beginning to stay away. We were already talking about, well, what's the future? And then the bishops of Scotland met and decided that our churches should close for the good of our brothers and sisters, that health and life come first. So again, a bit like the Episcopal Church, by and large, people recognised that that was appropriate, and there were one or two who had their doubts about it and wanted to continue. But again, like the Bishop has said, it gave people permission to say, look, this is not on. So we had a letter that came to us on the Wednesday, and our last masses were on the 19th of March, and we closed down from there.
You mentioned that some people wanted to continue, but you'd mentioned that people were raising concerns. Were people already beginning to stay away before that happened?
Yes, in the couple of weeks prior to the lockdown, I noticed that people were beginning to stay at home, and we were already in the process in many of our parishes about thinking about how do we reach these people. So some of us had already started, who hadn't already, to say, for example, put in online facilities and so on, because we could see it coming down the road. We didn't realise it would be as, if you like to use the word, brutal as that. We thought we might be restricted or there might be something else, but and it was a bit of a blow when the word came down. But at the end of the day, I think most people recognised it was appropriate.
Thank you. Dr. Hodson, we've heard there from the messages coming down from the authorities in the other two churches. I understand from what you've told us, the authority might be slightly different in terms of the Baptist Church. How was it approached when we were at the beginning of the pandemic?
Well, as my colleagues have said, the moment came when we realised that churches did need to stop gathering on a Sunday and indeed at other times, and I think I found myself in a position of giving an extremely strong message, which I perhaps a little, as you said, I felt could be going beyond my kind of normal authority, but these were exceptional times, and I recommended in the most serious of terms that every church followed this guidance and stop meeting. And it was interesting because I think there were I think we were all in a state of shock, and there were some unusual reactions from us, and there were one or two people who got back to me and said things like, well, surely God wouldn't allow this to happen in the place of worship, which I can kind of see where that thought comes from. But very quickly there was a settled view. Of course, this is common sense. If we're going to love our neighbour, the only way we can love our neighbour is by trying our utmost to avoid spreading this infection to them. So it was an interesting, slightly bumpy ride. But there was, at an early stage, an agreement this was right.
Was there a degree of resistance then in terms of some of the churches to closing?
No, I think there were some individuals who struggled with it. I think the churches all recognised that corporately, this was the right thing to do, yeah.
So we've heard very early on the churches were closing, or closed, I suppose, at that point. Canon has indicated to us that even before we got there, people were beginning to look forward in terms of how we might address these things. I'd like to ask you about the things which the church has put in place at the beginning of the pandemic, and indeed going through in terms of how to cope with a closed church. Canon, perhaps I could come to you first in that regard.
Yes, a lot of us were able to go online. Some churches already had a feed for the housebound. Many of us were kind of thinking about when we get a bit of money, we might put something in place for those who are housebound. And so we were already thinking along these lines. Rapidly, many of us put in place something that could have online access. Again, the telephone ministry became a big thing. Parish priests phoning around their parishioners. Also gathering information. A lot of our parishioners are very helpful in sending in emails and gathering that kind of information so that emails could be sent out. The parish bulletin, which traditionally was handed out at the back of the church, was now online or through an email or something like that. Where appropriate, and through, sticking to the measures and the restrictions, people might leave something, a leaflet or something, through people's door. Priest studies, when you were doing your walk, you would very often put something through the door. We were more or less a bit nervous about that because of the business of transmission. So those were the kind of things that were going on. A lot of the clergy, myself included, were just wrestling with new technology, things that we were unfamiliar with. And it was a process of trial and error, mostly error, but we got there. And I think that was enabled us to reach out to people. Our particular brand, if you like, of Christianity is a very physical one, sacramental. So people took it very, very hard not to be physically present. And for a minister, I'm sure my colleagues would say the same, ministry is all about presence. The first thing you learn as a young priest minister is to turn up, whatever you're going to say or do, be there. So we had to find new ways of being present, which was, different priests and ministers did different things, but that about sums it up.
Thank you. And Bishop, could I come to you next? How did the Episcopal Church address matters?
Initially, I think we focused most strongly on pastoral care. I think the worship side probably took us a few weeks to really properly get our thoughts together. But the immediate thought when we couldn't gather together was to focus on pastoral care. So much as the canon was saying, priests telephoning around their congregations. I know I, as a bishop, phoned around all my clergy. I had a little spreadsheet so I could make sure I spoke to them all in turn, and just making sure everybody was okay. The anxiety levels were so high with the COVID news and all of the transmission. We did move to online worship. One or two of our churches maybe had the facility for that before the pandemic. But we fairly quickly started producing a weekly recorded service done by one of the bishops, assisted by their own household, because that's how we had to do it, generally recorded on one of our mobile phones. So we were in our houses recording a service. It was a communion service, and we were doing the mental gymnastics of what that meant, recording a communion service, wanting God to be in the bread and the wine, and then somebody X hours later will be watching it on TV in their own home or on YouTube in their own home. But we were offering a regular weekly service that was broadcast at the same time on a Sunday. Everybody was invited to participate in that. And we noticed quite quickly people started interacting in the chat on YouTube and on Facebook. It was like the post-service coffee. People were saying, "Oh, hello, how are you? Oh, I'm in Hamilton, I'm in Aberdeen, And there was quite a community sense started to grow around the offering of the recorded services that we put together. People loved the curtains in my dining room. It had a very sort of authentic look behind it, apparently.
That's just to be clear, that's pre-recorded. You said recorded ceremonies and then broadcast on YouTube, presumably that people can then watch at their leisure. Yep. Did you move on to live?
Not for a long time. Our tech people were quite nervous about live on the grounds of how badly it can go wrong, or when the tech goes awry. Probably it wasn't 2 years later that we started beginning to offer live services with a small delay just in case things went awry. But all through 2020 and through 2021, we were still offering a pre-recorded service, initially just done by bishops, and then latterly it started to be done by some other folk. Over that time, churches started to get their own technology, and more clergy began to do a mixture of pre-recorded or live streaming. So I think we probably have maybe as many as 100 of our churches now might still have some sort of, probably mainly live streamed offering now. But no, initially it was pre-recorded and put out.
Thank you. And Dr. Hodson, if I could come to you again, thinking about the initial stages in terms of lockdown, how did the Baptist Church address that?
Many similarities to what my colleagues have said. I think there were two priorities. The one was, how do we experience Sunday worship in a virtual environment, and the other was pastoral care. regarding Sunday worship, the move online for some churches was very exciting. Quite a number of our churches have paid quite a lot of attention to kind of creating more of a conference-style church building with screens and PA system and quite a lot of tech, and that therefore meant that they had people in the churches who were quite sort of interested in tech and tech aware and were happy to lead on the journey into creating online worship experiences, and there would be a variety. I mean, some ministers would stand in the church in the church building and present a service to an empty room that would be livecast. Quite a lot of churches did pre-recording using, and then would play it at kind of 10:30 on a Sunday morning on YouTube. And I think there was an interesting flowering of creativity in that space, actually. We didn't offer a kind of a central offering like the bishop and the Episcopal Church did. It was down to each local church to kind of create their own thing, which is very much our culture. Local churches do their own thing. They don't take it from elsewhere. And there was some really interesting participation by different people. Lots of churches would include in their YouTube feed, you know, as aspects of worship, different people telling their story of walking with God during the lockdown and this kind of thing. And it actually was quite enriching. There were some churches that were quite left behind, who didn't have any strength in tech to start with, and other churches supported them. Some would do very simple things. The minister sitting in his study with his phone on the desk, simply leading a service and transmitting it that way. A number of churches decided, especially smaller churches, decided to stay with a Zoom environment where people were much more obviously in the room rather than playing a pre-recorded YouTube service. They felt it was very important to keep that dimension where you might have a time of prayer where lots of people could spontaneously pray, or where there would just be a sense of seeing one another's faces in worship. So I think that was our tech experience. Just on the pastoral side, there was a strong awareness of the disconnection that this lockdown was bringing about, and especially for people who had physical or social or psychological needs and needed support. And within our churches, as my colleague said, there was a lot of systematic phoning around. A number of churches had kind of buddying systems where someone was linked to someone else and would just keep in touch with them. There was that element of ministers who weren't able to visit people. I remember a particular story about a minister who would kind of wave through the window to an elderly lady, and then she would open the window and he would stand in the garden and they would speak for a little while, which I think was probably just about legitimate at the time. But there was this kind of nice stories of people trying to find the limits and bring about pastoral care in that way.
Thank you. We've spoken there about the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdown, and we know from other evidence lockdown didn't last forever, and we started to come out of that. I'd like to talk to you now about the steps that the church has put in place as things began to open up again. I appreciate there was some ebbs and flows in that, but Canon, if I could perhaps come to you first, what arrangements did the Catholic churches put in place, both for their own churches and more generally in terms of their operations, in terms of reopening?
So first of all, there were a couple of groups came together. I was on one of them initially, an infection control group, which looked at how can we coordinate with the government, its guidelines, how can we get people physically back into the church, what are the restrictions going to be, and looking at the practice of our faith, Mass, the physical distribution of communion, all of these issues, we tried to talk them through. So that group came together a good wee while before we opened up. I think it was July, if I'm right in saying, we started to open up. So before that then, that was quite well communicated. That was one of the things we found, that the communication between the government and the churches and our church was actually quite good. And we were able to voice concerns and get answers fairly quickly, and then transmit them down to the churches from the bishop's office. Later on, there was a person who was appointed in each diocese to be the kind of liaising person who would let us know what the guidelines were going to be, what was permitted, what was not going to be permitted. So once that information had been communicated, a date had been fixed when churches could open, and we were very keen to open as quickly as we could, but also aware that we didn't want to put too much pressure on people, particularly in smaller churches who perhaps didn't have the resources in terms of people to clean and all these other things. But once that date was set when we could open up, the churches got into gear. It was very heartening to see people come together in parishes to volunteer to clean, to be passkeepers, to welcome people. Once the attendance at church started again, we were asking people to sit in various places that were clearly marked. We had people who would welcome them, guide them to the seat, make sure that people arrived in good time. Catholics were particularly grateful that the priest wasn't going to preach and that the Mass would be curtailed to about half an hour, which was the kind of time limit. So we had a kind of fast turnover, but people really responded well, and we felt the communication was good. There were a few inconsistencies as the years went on. We felt that sometimes there was a sort of mixed message for social spaces, and while churches were still being restricted, again, as has probably been said by Bishop McGee when he was talking about weddings, funerals, etc., that was a kind of painful time during lockdown. Again, as the restrictions were lifted, we were still very conscious of the numbers of people that were permitted. But again, I have to say it worked pretty well. People were very, very good and very, very responsive.
You talked there about fast turnovers. Was that churches having more services then?
Yes, and particularly over, if you remember, the lockdown came at the beginning of the Christian season of Lent, so we celebrated Easter behind closed doors, as it were, and online. July, most churches would have tried to perhaps put on another Mass if we could, to try and to get as many people who wanted to be there to be present. But there were various systems which we used. Some of the bigger churches used online booking services like Eventbrite, I think, that kind of a thing. We tended in the smaller parishes, because you knew your folk a wee bit more, we tended to have rotas, so people put their name down then, and we kind of did a hybrid with online and emailing systems to remind people it's your Sunday this Sunday, please come along. If you can't come, please let us know so that somebody else can get your slot. But by and large, it worked pretty well, I have to say. But there was a fast turnover sometimes, and particularly if you remember Christmas that year, just before the second lockdown, and it was over the weekend, if you remember. A lot of us were pretty tired at the end of it because we were doing services all the way through and getting in as many people as we could. I had the assistant, as many had, of other priests who were able to help me. But it was pretty fast turnover sometimes.
Thank you. Bishop, if I could come to you next. What did opening up look like in the Episcopal Church?
We started an internal group in the Episcopal Church in May, so the lockdown was in March, and it seemed evident we were going to have to open. And I would agree entirely with what my colleague said. The guidance that came from the Scottish Government on what one should do was pretty clear, but it did need quite a lot of interpretation in local contexts. Individual churches wanted to know, well, if we were to do this, if we were to clean with a fogger, would that be all right? If we were to use this particular hand sanitizer, would that be all right? This is our view on social distancing. So we created a group with some expertise. We had someone who was ordained, who had been a director of public health before they were ordained. We had an ordained microbiologist. We had a retired Scottish Government official. We had the Secretary General. I was on it as a bishop, and it was an advisory group. We called it Advisory Group on Reopening Churches. We would take the Scottish Government guidance and translated a little bit into Scottish Episcopal language, so people would understand it in terms of our Eucharist, the communion service that we would have. And then queries would come back to that group with people saying, is it acceptable if we take a certain approach? We made each bishop responsible for the sign-off of churches. Each church had to produce a plan that had elements of risk assessment and demonstrated their compliance with the rules. And the advisory group drafted a template. So each church produced a proposal as to how they would open, and the bishop would then sign it off to say that was meeting the requirement. And again, we didn't put pressure on churches that they had to reopen in July. They were allowed to open, but some clergy were quite nervous. Some small church communities didn't feel they were ready to open at that point, and that was absolutely fine. We weren't forcing anyone to open, but they were allowed to. The ones who were very, very keen, they opened. We didn't shorten the services to half an hour or remove the sermon. We structured ourselves slightly differently in what we did, probably more trying to make the service as close as possible to what people would have had before the pandemic, noting face coverings, social distancing, hand sanitizer, no singing, those sorts of things. But we tried as far as possible to make the experience the sort of encounter with God that people would expect. And we also produced a video. So we made a film of what it might look like in July 2020 for people to go back and encounter church, just to help people get over the strangeness. They were worried it might be a really odd experience. So we got a small group of people organised in households and made a video in Forfar of what it would look like when people went back, to try and calm people down a little bit. I think I was the camera person because I was in a household, so that would work.
Thank you. Dr. Hodson, in the Baptist Union, what did reopening look like?
We went through similar processes of advising churches how to respond to the Scottish Government advice in our context and how to risk assess what they were doing. I think that what it looked like was quite strange. Although it was coming back to worship in person, people came into a familiar building, but they couldn't sit near to other people. They were either sitting on their own, physically distanced, or with a little family group. There was tape on the floor saying this is the one-way system, you can walk this way. There were signs saying, this is 2 meters different distance apart. If there was someone, you weren't allowed to sing together, which made worship seem quite strange. There might be someone singing at the front, but they would have a perspex screen in front of them. So it was a strange thing, I would say, coming back to worship. It kind of was coming back to worshipping together, but it also wasn't. It was a different species in lots of ways, and the shadow of COVID still hung quite heavily over our gatherings.
You've mentioned singing there, a difference in terms of practice, in terms of singing. How did that go down with your parishioners?
The fact that we weren't permitted to sing, that was one of the hardest things, I think, for us in corporate worship. I know almost all Christian believers sing together in worship. I think it is definitely a big part in Scottish Baptist life, and it was one of the points where some of the tensions began to be felt, because some people were saying, I sing in a community choir and we're allowed to meet and sing together, but in worship in church on Sunday we're not. So that was one of those sort of difficult points where there didn't seem to be consistency and regulation for quite a period of time, and that irked some people. That caused some stress.
You've told His Lordship about the practice of baptism and full immersion. Did that change at all during the period?
Well, it was an issue of ongoing discussion with the Scottish Government, and at first, when swimming pools reopened, we thought, surely this is the moment when believers' baptism by immersion can resume, but we were told quite clearly that wasn't the case, and there was an ongoing conversation with government officials about this, and eventually it was agreed that, well, the suggestion was that someone could self-baptise, and that was the preferred way. That wasn't theologically really something that we were. I think stand in the pool and dip yourself down. But it was agreed that a sole minister could baptise someone, the minister would be masked if not the person being baptised, and chlorine tablets would be placed in the water, which is probably a good practice anyway. So there were certain mitigations, which actually baptisms eventually looked quite normal compared to some of the other things we were doing when we were finally allowed to do that.
Thank you. We've spoken there about some of the changes that have been made or that were made. I'd like to talk to you now about the impacts of those changes and indeed of lockdown on your parishioners specifically and how they felt over the piece, if I may. Perhaps I could come to you first, Dr. Hodson. What was the reaction of the community in terms of these changes being implemented? How did it go down, I suppose? The changes as we were coming back together? Really, I think what I'd like to give his lordship a feel for is how was the community feeling about not being able to go to church, and then about some of the changes coming in as they came in. You've spoken already about some of the feeling about not being able to sing and some of the inconsistencies. What were people telling you? What was the feedback you were getting?
I think the general feedback was we're doing our best to do the right thing in difficult circumstances, and there was a strong sense of goodwill. How given that this has landed upon us, how can we do this as well as possible? I think that because the complete lockdown at the beginning had been so drastic, any hints and any possibilities of coming together, even in slightly incongenial circumstances, as I just described, was better than nothing. And the vast majority of people wanted to do that and make it work. So whilst there were undercurrents of frustration, I think the community of communities in the local churches did come together quite strongly and just try and make it work within the restrictions we had. There were a few voices who were outraged that we didn't go from lockdown to complete freedom, but that was a minority, and there was definitely a strong sense that we could do this together. I think as time went on, particularly kind of in the second lockdown, people were very tired. It was an adventure organising online worship and then organising modified worship at the beginning. But as time went on, it became tiring, and especially for people who were maybe homeschooling their children as well, or worrying about their ageing relatives who were susceptible to health issues and had got a whole stack of other things weighing on them. I think that made it hard. And for ministers, I think the journey for ministers was that at the beginning there was a lot of energy released in, like, we've got to fix this, we've got to make this work. But later on, ministers were feeling extremely tired, and really, as the pandemic came to an end, I think suddenly realised how worn down and worn out they were by that.
Did that have any impact on the ministers remaining within the church?
Well, it didn't. To my surprise, I think there is one person who took early retirement, saying, "I just had to do after the pandemic." I really feared that would be the case. I think ministers, some changed pace, a number received counselling, and that was kind of supported by the Baptist Union. We encouraged ministers in that direction. But in fact, no, it didn't end up with people leaving ministry.
Thank you. Bishop, if I could come to you next. Again, I'm interested to hear the impact on the community, and in particular if there was any particular rites that might ordinarily have been carried out that might have had a particular impact on people.
Mm-hmm. I think a similar story to the Baptist Church, where initially the shock of lockdown and it happening meant I think everyone was pretty much compliant, and there was a sense of solidarity in the adversity of COVID. So everybody was not really thinking about what had been lost. It was more, how do we get through it? But as time went on, in our tradition, we would use an anointing when somebody was ill or if they were about to die. Again, we have a lot of touch. We shake hands, we hug. There's the pastoral social side of church has a lot of tactile elements in it, and all of that went out the window. And quite a few churches is still there, still gone, even now. So 5 years on, there are some churches who haven't gone back to the same amount of touch in the way that we worship, in the way that we relate to each other. Yeah, I think as we went through the cycle, much as with the Baptist Church, people found it harder to cope, particularly when things changed rapidly. As we approached the second lockdown at the end of 2020, people who were quite sanguine and stoic in the early lockdown became quite frustrated. There was more anger came out. Some slightly difficult behaviour started to appear in some of the churches. There's always conflict in churches, just that's churches. But some quite difficult stuff started to bubble up, and people would get upset about strange little things. And I think it was that frustration and anxiety and some of the constraints people struggled to understand. So the local authority travel constraints and levels and tiers, and people struggled to see the logic in some of those. And I think a bit of frustration started to appear, which, no, the communities generally all the way through, I think, they were compliant, the sense of wanting to protect each other, take care of each other. God wanted people to be safe, so we'll do those things. But there definitely was a bit of frustration, and sometimes anger would bubble out as things went on.
You used the phrase anointing there, and for those perhaps not in the Christian tradition who might be watching, what exactly does that involve?
So it's taking some oil that's been specially blessed in a service, and when someone's baptised, we would probably tend to baptise people as babies in our tradition rather than adult baptism, but they would be marked with some of this blessed oil. Or if someone is ill, again, we would use some oil to anoint them. If they were close to death, they would be anointed as well. So it's taking a little bit of blessed oil and putting it on someone's body.
Thank you. And again, Canon, if I could perhaps ask you about the impact on your parishioners. And in particular, could ask, were there any particular groups that were affected more, young, old, or women, men, I don't know, that you'd noted were particularly feeling the pain, as it were, during the piece?
Yes, a similar story to my colleagues here, and to pick up on the Bishop's point, one of the sources of pain for us was we have a tradition, even those who wouldn't have been practicing their faith would tend to still call for the priest if they were dying. And one of the frustrations that we experienced was the inconsistency and accessibility. The care homes, for example, wouldn't allow the priest in at all. Some hospitals would, depending on the health board or depending on the local practice. So, for example, my experience and that of my colleagues would have been to, through the window, pray for a person who was dying while their family were kind of at a distance staring at their loved one through the care home window. That was a particularly difficult time for people. For the young, again, I've mentioned our Catholic schools. Fortunately, we were able to set up a number of online assemblies and that kind of thing that went on, which were good. But again, when our young people started to come back to the churches, either at school masses or whatever, the behavioural issues began to surface. So again, as with most events, the young and the old were perhaps impacted more than others. Similar story to my colleagues in terms of how the clergy handled things. I think we were all a bit tired by the end of it, especially after the second lockdown. In terms of impact on the congregation, I would say most of our people who were regularly attending have come back to regular attendance. Some haven't. And for some, it was an occasion for them reassessing their priorities. For some, that meant a deepening of faith, and we had a series of of events, as did a lot of parishes, where we did these, what we call Emmaus walks, out of a kind of an incident in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus walks with the disciples towards the road to Emmaus. And that was a very fruitful experience because people were enabled to unload a lot of the angst that they had, and they were able to, it was still socially distanced, or you could walk outside. So we did a lot of that, and people really unburdened themselves, which was a very, very humbling experience, the way that people had not only coped but thrived and looked after each other. It really was quite a humbling experience. For others, again, the reassessment of priorities meant that they felt that they could live without the church, and that has meant a few people haven't come back and so on. But by and large, similar to my colleagues here, it was an experience which touched most of us, but which most of us survived and even thrived.
Thank you. We've spoken, or you've spoken, about some of the guidance that was coming out from the government. We've heard from a number of witnesses, and I appreciate that all three of your traditions were involved with the government's faith and belief engagement group. I'd like to ask you now, each of you, first of all, whether you were involved or whether you're aware your church was involved with any planning for a pandemic in advance, and secondly, how you felt the government's response operated, and whether there's anything you think they could have done bluntly better. Canon, perhaps I could come to you first.
Yes, I'm not aware that the church or any of the churches were involved in pre-pandemic planning. I think quite quickly, particularly when the communication to churches and guidance was coming through, I think very quickly the communication was quite good. And I think most churches managed to get good people to liaise with the government. And I'm also aware that the church leaders were involved in discussions with the Scottish Government and in groups that met either informally or formally. Whether there was a regular meeting as time went on, I don't know, but there were meetings. So I think communications got better, and I think that's is the key to most things. To keep that going would be one of the things I would like to see, so that when something future happens, at least there's a group established, telephone numbers are there, people can get together very quickly and say, look, this is coming down the line, what should we do?
Thank you. Bishop, could I ask you the same?
Again, similarly, I'd say communication was very good. Both the communication on a regular basis, so that the First Minister and Jason Leach say, communicating the broad message about where COVID was. I know our advisory group would sit there waiting for the broadcast and jotting down whatever was going to happen, and that would then be followed up via the engagement group. Our Secretary General, the lead layperson in the church, was part of the engagement and regular meetings, and I think that communication, that did work really, really well. I did feel things got quite complex, so as the systems were designed and developed, and as time went by, there was a complexity about some of the constraints that were being put in place that were quite hard for individual people in churches or even church leaders to be able to make sense of. When the distances you could travel in a local authority, for example, meant that people in the wilds of Scotland could travel many, many, many miles to worship. And I live in Dundee, where the whole place is about 10 miles across. So there were major constraints on who was allowed to travel and who wasn't. And there was a complexity. I think, again, the communication with the government as policies and procedures were developed was good. And our advisory group was once asked to comment on a draft proposal that when you were looking at 2 metre spacing in church, you would take account of the diameter of the worshippers, not just the distance they were apart. And I think we commented back that maybe wasn't ideal. That was probably fat shaming, so you don't want to do that. But there was a bit of dialogue over what would actually be practicable and what would actually work in particular settings. But no, the complexity made it hard to cope, and I do think by the end of it, certain churches maybe started to not care so much about the detail because of the amount of complexity in it.
You mentioned...
and we weren't involved in any pre-pandemic planning. I checked. I know we were involved in things like the swine flu outbreak in Argyll a number of years before because of the local area, but we hadn't been involved in pre-pandemic planning.
Thank you. You mentioned in your statement, Bishop, I think the Belief and Faith group got together in June 2020, which was a number of months after the beginning of the pandemic. And I think you'd also mentioned that it could have included other members, public bodies, for example, in that group. Could you... sorry, forgive me, that's Mr. Hodson. Those of you there. Do you have any view about that in terms of how quickly that came together?
And actually, no, not really. I think we were all on the back foot from March and April and May, just trying to work out how to deal with a pandemic. So I think when that dialogue started to happen, from my perspective, it felt timely, and the guidance that we had in our advisory group and within the churches, the timing of that seemed to fit where we were.
Thank you. And finally, again, Dr. Hodson, if I could ask you the same question, firstly, whether you were involved with any pre-pandemic planning and how you found engagement with the government.
Yeah, we weren't involved in any pre-pandemic planning. I agree with the others that in so many ways the communication was good from government. And I was part of the faith and belief engagement group that was set up at an early stage, I think probably in the May or June of 2020. And that was an extremely helpful group where there was a senior representative from the different Christian denominations and other faith groups in Scotland. And there was typically explanation of the latest guidance or regulations that were emerging from government and engagement around that. And whilst we were clear that we still remained rule takers rather than rule makers, we did have a voice in the process and were able to raise issues, including the girth of worshippers and such matters, and how appropriate that was. But and I mentioned before the questions about resuming believers' baptism, and that was a context in which we were able to just explain there are issues here that perhaps haven't become obvious. So that was a very helpful group. I think that was of significant benefit. I would nevertheless, I think, say that there was an issue in that it seemed that government, there was a category called places of worship, and we came under the places of worship guidance, but government didn't seem to understand that churches can't be reduced to a place of worship, whilst we'd kind of said that central Sunday gathering, which is what you'd expect to happen in a place of worship, is fundamental to what we are. We run children's activities, which were coming under guidance for children's activities, or were they? It wasn't really clear. Or were they, if a children's activity happened during a Sunday worship service, did it come under, which set of guidance did it come under? Children's guidance or Sunday worship guidance? If you were running a parent and toddler group in the church during the week, as many churches did, when it was possible for those to happen, they came under completely different guidance. If you were running a recovery group, that came under completely different guidance. And these would all be things that would perhaps be quite important parts of church life. And I guess the list could go on. So I felt that there was perhaps not just a lack of literacy about what contemporary church looks like, and that it can't be reduced to just place of worship. Churches are communities within a wider community who are doing good in all kinds of ways, who are gathering people in all kinds of contexts. So I was kind of, just felt that could have been understood better. The other thing that I did think about regarding the government approach was, it was clear that Sunday worship services did need to be closed down, but that is quite a dramatic thing to say to Christian churches, partly because freedom of belief has just been a very big issue historically for us, and a point we've got to that's been really important. And also, many of our churches would recognise their part in the worldwide church, where in many countries of the world the freedom to worship openly week by week isn't available and isn't possible, it's illegal, and many of our churches would be praying for persecuted parts of the church. And so all kinds of buttons were pressed for us when we were told we couldn't meet for worship. Now, it's not clearly that decision was necessary to close worship, but I think some understanding of the depth and significance of saying to Christian churches in Scotland in the 21st century, you cannot meet together, would have helped the understanding of that.
Did you give that feedback to the government at the time?
I think it gradually dawned on me, and I spoke about it in the Faith and Belief group, but I didn't make any more formal representation.
And do you feel ultimately that the government took that into account in terms of their approach? Did you see any evidence of them taking that into account in terms of a greater understanding?
Not really, no.
I just have one area left to touch upon with you, but I'm just going to give you notice at this point that after I do that, I'm going to give you each an opportunity. If there's anything that we haven't touched upon this morning, we obviously have your statements that will be taken fully into account, but I'm going to give you each an opportunity at the end. If there's anything you particularly want to highlight to His Lordship before we finish up, then you'll have that opportunity. But my last thing I would like to ask you about is legacy. Whether there have been any changes to practice, any changes. Canon, you've already mentioned some of the changes in terms of the attendees that attended the church. But if there have been any changes that you've noted in your own churches, I'd be interested to hear that. Perhaps, Bishop, I could come to you first.
Yeah. In many ways, in 2025, if you were to go into a Scottish Episcopal church, the feel would be if you'd gone into it in 2019. So in many ways, we have now returned our pattern of worship and the singing and the way we conduct communion, fundraising activities, social events. All those things have now returned. But things are also different in some ways. Most of our churches will still have hand sanitizer available somewhere, which wouldn't have been there before. There was a little bit in a few churches, but hand sanitizer would now be available. Some churches have fundamentally changed the way that certain parts of the worship would work. So sharing the peace. At a point in our services, people would shake hands and greet each other, and it would be part of the ritual, would be to greet each other. And that all had to stop even when we returned in 2020. Most churches have reintroduced it, but some churches absolutely haven't. They will just stand and nod at each other or not really interact in that way. There's maybe a little bit more stiltedness and a little bit more reserve in the way that people are tactile with each other. And our numbers, we were in gentle decline before the pandemic, and we're probably still in a state of gentle decline overall now. It may be accelerated a little bit. People died. Certain people did lose the habit of worshipping, or they found it uncomfortable and just didn't end up coming back. But also, some of our churches are now experiencing growth. New people are coming in. I think the pandemic made people ask some big questions about God and life and meaning, and that's encouraged some people to be drawn into the communities. Another legacy is the fact of broadcasting worship. So a lot of our churches now have equipment to broadcast quite high quality acts of worship. Our cathedral in Dundee has a set of cameras and someone managing an editing screen, and that's now broadcast each Sunday when the worship is happening, which we didn't have beforehand. So some positive bits of legacy that are there as well. I think I said in my statement we had an odd one in the Episcopal Church where our investment portfolio, which we rely on quite heavily, happened to have quite a lot of new technology investment, and that survived the pandemic really rather well. So we came out of it probably financially stronger than we went into it. which again we are trying to use that for mission, for ministry, to see the sorts of ways that we can help the church achieve growth and do some things like that. I think that there's nervousness about a pandemic happening again, and the trauma, the missed funerals, the dislocation, the lockdowns. There's a lot of psychological and spiritual trauma still in the people in our churches, and they would be fearful of something like that happening again. But that's just kind of there in the background.
Thank you. Can I ask you, we heard from some of the other clerics the other day that they'd stopped using sharing cups during communion. Have you done that?
No, my lord, we've not. It's another area where the bishops exercise power we don't actually have, and we just said no, we'll go back. Our tradition is to share a cup. In the middle of the pandemic, some churches asked if they could go to little individual cups instead, which wouldn't be our tradition. But we used authority we didn't have and banned it, and said they wouldn't do that, and they'd go back to the single cup. A lot of people, or if someone didn't like that, they can just take the bread, and some people would dip it in the cup. But no, we've stuck with our single cup.
Thank you.
Thank you. Karen, could I come to you next? Are there any particular changes or legacies that you've noted?
Very similar to what the Bishop has already outlined, the presence of equipment for online broadcast and so on would certainly be one of them. I think there has been an awareness of the vulnerability of some of our people. I mentioned that the vast majority of people got through it, but those who were perhaps already mentally and emotionally vulnerable felt the isolation particularly. And we must remember that, as it were, crises have gone on. We may have emerged from the COVID pandemic, but there's the cost of living, Ukraine war, and so on and so forth. People are living in a heightened state of anxiety, and that is something that we're picking up in the churches. And going forward, how do we best support those people? What can we put in place that can enable some people to grow? I know that a number of our local churches have, for example, been paying for people to go for counselling sessions because of the waiting lists and so on. We're aware of what's happening in the general society in Scotland, the UK, and we're trying our best to see how best we can help all of those people. But a bit like the Bishop, if you walked into a Catholic church in 2025, it would seem really quite familiar. And again, while some parishes have suffered a little, other parishes, particularly mine, a country parish, has flourished a bit more because people have moved in and away from the cities if they were able to do so because of the COVID experience. People in cities perhaps weren't able to get out much, whereas we in the country had plenty of places we could go on our walk that we were allowed to go on, and people realised that, and so they've shifted a bit. Financially, there has been an impact. That would be another legacy, whereas pre-COVID, a lot of our donations would come in cash or envelopes. A lot of parishioners have gone on to standing orders and so on, and that has been good and interesting and a challenge at the same time.
Thank you. Dr. Hodson.
I think it's important to note, as the Canon has done, that probably all of our churches would have some people for whom life has just not been the same since the pandemic. The psychological damage or the anxiety that is instilled has just stayed with them, and I think I'm sure that's true in any community, but that would be evident in churches, that there are some people who are struggling. That would just be a one kind of aspect of the inheritance of this. As the others have said, the use of technology, and particularly streaming services, worship services, has been quite significant for us. That continues. The majority of our churches would still be doing that. That's slightly changed the pattern of church attendance, in that most churches would say there are some people who on the whole, worship online now rather than showing up, or who here some of the time but sometimes decide to have pyjama worship at home, and which may or may not be a good thing. But other aspects of that are that newcomers coming to churches have almost always experienced the church online before they show up in the building. There's a kind of try before you buy opportunity there. And there are quite a number of elderly people, people who don't get out of the house, who have actually found it beneficial that churches have moved to streaming Sunday worship, and they actually include it now in a way they weren't before. For our churches at a national scale, the kind of the discovery of Zoom and the theological belief that actually God can be present in a virtual space as well as a physical space has led to a pattern of national prayer meetings and prayer gatherings throughout the year, which was not part of our life at all. So there's been a kind of a drawing together nationally, a tightening or deepening of the relationship, the fellowship in our national network. The one other thing I'd mention is I think there's been a churn of church participants. So our sense is that most of the people who were worshipping before the pandemic are worshipping again, but not necessarily with us. I think quite a few people who were Christians and regular worshippers have moved to different churches. I think we've definitely noticed a pattern that people have wanted to worship more locally, and so where people might have been travelling into a big city centre church, they are now decided to worship in their local church. I guess particularly amongst the broadly evangelical churches, there's always been a bit of a churn of participation, but the pandemic seems to have made quite a lot of people think, you know, will we stay with our current church or worship somewhere else? And I think for the Baptist churches, there has been some gain from that churn of participants.
Thank you. I'm noting the time, but I'm also conscious that we have quite a large break, so I'm going to seek His Lordship's indulgence and ask my final question, just to give you an opportunity.
Go to the cabin for indulgence.
Give you a very brief opportunity, if I may. If there's anything that you do wish to mention to His Lordship, which you've not had an opportunity to do this morning, Canon, perhaps I could come to you first, if there is anything else you wish to highlight to His Lordship.
Two brief things. One would be for the government to appreciate that while there are Christian churches, we're slightly different and we have slightly different emphases. And the second, connected to that, getting to know you has been a great thing. And we would encourage that, the continual communication between civil authority and church authority, so that, because a lot of it is not ill-intentioned, none of it probably, or very little of it, mostly it's ignorance of what actually happens. And this kind of inquiry and an ability to reflect, perhaps, occasions for reflection, not just in official inquiries like this, but also as we go on, times we could come together as civil and religious authorities and reflect on what's happening to our society more and more would be something that I would like to see happen.
Thank you. Bishop?
I think similarly, my Lord, the sense of government and faith communities working together. I found the experience of going back over all we had done in COVID, because we did move on to the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis. So going back and just being reminded of how much we did manage to work together. And I was impressed with all that government did, very impressed with what all of our church leaders managed to do. And we had a worked example in Dundee where we ended up signing a faith covenant that came out of COVID, where Christian churches and the Sikh Gurdwara and the tiny wee Hindu temple and the 3 mosques and the local authority signed up to a document to say we would work together for the greater good, because look at all that we managed to do in COVID, food poverty and clothing poverty. So some very good examples of working together did come out. But it's easy to move on and forget about them. So it was good to celebrate that. So no, thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Hodgson, it is finally this time.
Well, not much to add to that. Similarly, I think that it would be beneficial for the government to think more about how to partner with churches in a pandemic sort of situation, not just as vessels who will keep safe and promulgate the rules more widely, but who might have a creative part to play in the support of society, because churches are deeply embedded right across the country. And obviously we could sit here and tell endless stories, as you mentioned, about food poverty and clothing poverty and psychological support that churches give during that time. We were doing it because that's what we do. It would be interesting to think if there's a way in which that could be part of national policy and approach in a time of crisis. I think there is scope for greater religious literacy in government. The government did so much that was good and helpful and communicated well, but we've mentioned a number of areas where perhaps there wasn't really an understanding of what contemporary church was like, and some of the assumptions may have reflected more what church was like 50 or 100 years ago than what it's like today. So I think work done just on increasing religious literacy in government and civil service would not be time badly spent.
Thank you. Thank you all, my lord, unless your lordship has anything further.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turner. Thank you all, gentlemen. I'm very grateful. It's very interesting. I have quite enjoyed listening to all your clerics, and you have been appropriately reflective, which I think, as you've all just said, is actually very helpful. And I'll try and bear that in mind when I'm writing this report. So I'm very grateful to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, my lord.
Thank you.
We'll come back at 1:15. Good.
All right.